Hello, friends. Welcome back to Barriers and Boundaries Resilience Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, EB, and I have Steve Sapourn from the Neuro's Journey with me here today. How you doing, Steve?
I'm doing very well, EB. I'm thankful to be on your show today.
Man, it's good to chat with you and hear more about what this journey is, not just what the Neuro's journey is for you, but your own journey and how you came into this, how you got started with this. We'll eventually get to like the people that you want to help, talking about trauma and identity and how we relate as people to our own life circumstances. How do you normally begin a conversation that's so massive? How do you dial in and make it intentional?
What I like to talk about is certainly at this point, this is my purpose to get out really the blessings of my life. I think it's a very important thing to orient around some of these things. And I would say that I had four main blessings in my life, and three of them people would consider pretty severe childhood trauma. And one of them was an extremely loving mother that I was blessed, and I think is the reason why I'm here. And took me a long time to honestly orient around some of the difficult things and without going too far into details on it. Long-term sexual abuse. I witnessed a mass murder sort of on the street. I lived in a house with a veteran, landed on D-Day 2, Normandy Beach, war hero. Also didn't have the services and counseling and whatnot, and was a traumatized alcoholic that was pretty good out in the world and real difficult inside the house. And I didn't even know what trauma was until about 5 years ago. I thought I was a drug addict with a born wrong kind of thing. And then as I learned about trauma and started to orient that I actually had it, and went through this haphazard process of trying to heal myself. And that's something that I want to help people with, is to give them more of a lay of the land of how to approach this, because there's so many different lanes. There's regular therapy, somatic therapy, psychedelic therapy, this and that. And a real turning point for me was actually to get my brain scanned. We talked about this a little bit, and to see that, to have somebody look at my personal behaviors and how I was acting in a more of a medical context, to say, oh, when I look at your brain scan, it exhibits the tendencies of someone that's had trauma. You probably have these behaviors, which it sounded like this guy was living in my house. Can't sleep, anxiety, blowing up, addiction, all these things. And they're like, we can move you in the direction of a more normal brain compared to compared to the database. And that, amongst many things, psychedelic assisted therapy, very important. It's a difficult landscape. You really need to learn about it. But really what happened was, I'd been in finance for 30 years, and I'd been working on this problem pretty hard for about 5. And last year, I had the feeling that my nervous system had regulated to the point that I actually felt normal again. And that, in that something that would happen that would need my nervous system to amp up would happen, and then it would come down. And I had so many less regrets, and really everything changed in my life. It was interesting. I had oriented around healing trauma, and I thought, okay, what's going to happen is I'm going to be Steve without trauma. And then as my nervous system regulated it a bit, what turned out to happen was everything in my life shifted radically, from my behaviors as a father, with my partner, in my businesses. It allowed me an opportunity to have a spirituality that I had really shunned, because my abuse happened at a church. And when that happened, I felt there were probably millions of men, especially, who'd had some of these experiences. And for whatever reason, the way my psychology processes my sexual abuse, I don't have a lot of shame around that particular thing. I had a lot of shame in life, but that some 60-year-old man targeted a 5 and 6-year-old boy, I'm not ashamed to talk about. And I know that telling my story has been helpful, and I am just trying to take those blessings, the love that I received from my mom, which I also rejected, as I rejected all the other things, I realized I rejected the love a little bit too, and showing that out there. And I decided I'm going to show myself to the world a little bit, see if I can be of service, if I can be helpful in any way. And so I started a podcast, which you've watched some of. really talk about these experiences and life experiences, tools for people to regulate themselves. And I'm writing a book, and all of these things are aimed at seeing if I can be helpful and take, my story, my blessings, and make it something that the wider world could.
And I want to highlight the story aspect of this because I think it's easy to disassociate or ignore or hide. And we see a lot of that with those who are really dealing with shame in a sense. They really try to hide and have an outlet of some sort that is probably unhealthy for the most part.
I was fortunate in my psychology, and the way we adapt to these situations is the way we adapt. But I always had a forward looking sort of bent. So I think if you live in the future more, you're probably tend towards anxiety. And if you live in the past, you tend towards depression. And I definitely had depression without knowing it, but I was an anxious person and I was future oriented. So I generally had the mindset that things could be better in the future. I desperately did not want to be in the present. And that was a lot of what you said from success, from operating. I did the dual tracks of trauma in that I was an entrepreneur and I was young and I was managing hundreds of millions of dollars and making millions of dollars in my 20s. And I said one of the blessings of my life was my mother's love, and she died in my mid 20s. And that took somebody who was pretty addicted and turned them into a all pro addiction person. So I was doing entrepreneurship by day and crack addiction by night, and still trying to be better. I had the impulse towards it, but really what I thought, and you talk about this shame, is I felt that I was broken inside. And so there's a cap on what you're willing to do when you feel like there's something wrong with you. And so as I started to untease this, I had the great fortune to stumble into a men's group that I hosted last night. We've been doing it for 10 years. And so through seeing a different kind of man and seeing people not so oriented around addiction or even money, the different way men operated in the world, having a very kind and wise man who facilitated the group, who started to ask me questions, things to say out loud. He's like, Steve, I want you to try out loud saying this sentence. Deep down inside, I feel like a bad man. And man, that was the first time I was ever vulnerable, especially with men in my life, because I didn't even know that I felt that about myself, but I burst into tears and I really couldn't stop. It was clearly something that had been running my life for so long. And what was interesting about that is the reflections I got from the guys were like the best ones I'd ever gotten. Like, we finally feel you. We really connect with you in this way, because they had been telling me for years that they thought I looked sad. And I would joke with them, I don't think you're very good at this, these kinds of things, because I didn't really know what was going on, which I did through hypnosis. What was interesting is I took this young boy's voice on in the therapy session, and she's asking me what's happening. Someone's hurting me. Who's hurting you? The bad man. The bad man's doing this. The bad man's doing that. We teased out all the thing. And I realized at that point, this is what I've done. I've taken this guy who was actually a bad man, although I've tried to be loving and forgive him. I don't want to expel him from my psyche. And I've turned myself into that. And so there's this motivation in this to sort of say a little bit of like, fuck you to him, like, I'm not going to let you tell me I'm a bad man. And he tried to silence me. He told me he was going to kill me if I spoke. And I developed a really difficult stutter. So some of doing the podcast is a way for me to say, like, no, I'm not silenced anymore. I'm going to speak, and I'm going to speak from a good place. And yeah, there's a little bit of that energy for me, towards that situation that I don't want that to be the defining situation in my life. And really, it permeated me with so much fear that I really realized that almost every decision I was making until I made a choice to really handle this was out of fear from the food I was eating to the drugs I was taking to the business. It was all this fear-based program. And at some point, when you learn enough about this system, I think you decide, I'm going to make a choice. My brain adapted to what happened to me. That adaptation served me well at the beginning, and I have some things that outwardly people would, respect. I've been successful in business and whatnot. But I also knew that it wasn't allowing me to be the father that I could be. It wasn't allowing my kids to feel safe enough around me to bring the difficult things in their life to me because they wanted to paint the picture of everything was great because really I couldn't handle it. And so it becomes a snowball process. As you answer that question, I'm going to change. And at first it was for me. I didn't feel selfish about it, but I think maybe some people could think it was a selfish endeavor. But what really started to get the ball rolling was as I started to see that, oh, this is really impacting the system around me. This is impacting my son. This is impacting my fiance, my daughter, the people that interact with me. Then it becomes this sort of like, oh, this is not for me. I'm doing something good here. And then what's, more recently come on is a spirituality to say, like, I'm not this little being, but I have something in me that's timeless and eternal, and it's very loving. And that's what I wish to put out into the world. And what I hope is that if you meet me in the coffee shop, and we chat for a couple minutes and we don't talk about any of this stuff, you could feel there's love that I have for you because you're a human being. And I don't always live to that, but it's what I aspire to. And so that's a very different thing than aspiring to assets and money and those kinds of things. To be helpful in a way that really is a little bit inwardly focused. Like I know for me, and I'm not saying it's for everybody, but for me to put that way of being out, I need to meditate. I need to take care of myself in certain ways, and I need to prioritize that in ways that I never did. And then good things seem to happen, and people respond to me differently, and I get a lot more of connection back. And it's really been a really beautiful thing that's happened to me. And I think statistically, some of the things that have happened to me at the ages that they happen are very difficult. And I think I have a friend of mine who's a really big businessman. He's like, you have brand permission to talk about this stuff. You went through it, you did it. And so I feel confident in saying to people that no matter what you've been through, I think you can come back from it. My brother-in-law, well, my fiance's brother, we're working with him right now, but he has been on the streets and he's been homeless. And we've gotten him to rehab, and he's to a detox, and then we're going to take him and bring him here. But I was able to talk with him as someone who's also a drug addict and be like, this doesn't have to be your life, man. This can change, and I believe in you. And actually, the things that I see in you and what you've done, one, I'm not shocked by them, and I can really see a hero in there if you would believe it yourself. And so that's what I want to be in the world. I'm hopeful that I can be a good man for as long as I thought I was a bad man for.
Well, a lot of thoughts come up with what you described there. One, I would touch on when I think about trauma and the journey of trauma that people have to walk through sometimes, I think about Psalm 23, shadow of death, through valley of the shadow of death. And it gets dark. Hopefully you have a light to guide at least the next step. And I think a lot of the work that you're doing is trying to shine a light in a dark place. So God bless you. Props to you for doing that. But you talked about vulnerability earlier. I wanted to touch on that also. One of my favorite C.S. Lewis quotes, where he talks about to love at all is to be vulnerable. And so for people recovering or figuring themselves out or working through trauma, and they get to that beautiful place that you got to with being vulnerable. For me, reading that C.S. Lewis quote, to really get to a place to love yourself is to be at that place where you are vulnerable. Vulnerable with truth, vulnerable with reality, but not putting a label on it either. There's a Buddhist saying that Nothing is ever good or bad until you label it good or bad.
Mm.
And bringing in, inviting that spiritual nature to that dialogue, that conversation in your head, and what is actually taking place. That's a beautiful journey. That to get to that place is amazing. Seeing this is the work that you talked about having so much success and being able to buy anything or go anywhere. But for that, what was that like for you when you decided, what if I was to give instead of seek to get out of life?
Well, it's an interesting thing. There's a lot there in what you said. And one thing I want to clue in on, because I think there's an opportunity here. You and I talked before we got on a little bit about identity. And I think that men have been given from the very young age the raw deal on what the identity is and what courage really is. And I'll tell you a story in my, one of the traumas that I had is as I witnessed a mass murder, and I was in a car and I was 6 years old, and man running down the street, a veteran running down the street. He ran right in front of my car. My sister was in 7-Eleven, and he ran right and he looked at me, he pointed a gun at me, and he turned the other direction, and he killed some other people. And as I was researching my life a little bit, it turned out that he was only killing black people, which is the only reason why I'm here. But the reason why I'm relating that story is at 6 years old. So now my sister's running out. She's shuffling me into the 7-Eleven. I am telling myself, do not cry in there. Do not cry when you get in there. Do not cry when I'm 6 years old. I've witnessed like 4 people killed. And that's what's going through my head. And I really think there's a lot of misplaced courage. So for instance, in my people thought what I was doing in business was courageous. I was taking big risks in economics and whatnot. But it was actually something I was pretty good at, and I was avoiding what was mine to really be inside. And so I think there's an opportunity for us to say, we all have this path. I think the setup, you talk about Buddhism and the nature of that is there is suffering. You can't get out of it alive. And the Buddha's dad tried to create a perfect arena for him to never suffer. And yet he did. And I don't think we're intended to avoid suffering. There's enough suffering. We don't need to get needless suffering out there, but our life path is shaped by what happens to us. And I really think if we're old enough to reflect on these are the things, and I'm going to have the courage to do these things. And once you do them, so the vulnerability thing, I won't say that I had courage to be vulnerable that first time. I had a very skilled facilitator who tricked me into being vulnerable, but I did get some good feedback from it, and then I did. I started to realize, wow, that was a powerful moment, not just for me, for other people, and it wasn't so easy for me to talk about those things then. But I mean, you worked in the military for a long time. Guys who exhibit courage over and over, they start to get, okay, this is a thing. And I really think as men, we can lead by showing our families, showing the people that we love. I'm not going to avoid what's mine to deal with alcohol, with drugs, with overworking, with all these things. I'm going to show my kids that, like, yeah, some difficult things happen to me, and I'm not always pretty, and it's not always great what's going on with me. But that's what I care about. I'm going to have the courage to continue along. And I think that that's my view of it is a lot of the masculinity that we see out here is pretty unhealthy. And we might be at like a turning point for humanity. And if we can reframe courage, I think when you talk about vulnerability, Brene Brown seems to be the kind of main voice in that. And she says that you cannot be vulnerable without courage. And you can't really exhibit courage without being vulnerable, like in the military or any of these other things. And so we've been told as men to be these silent, stoic, the patriarchy, all this privilege that we had. I would push back a little bit on some of that. I don't necessarily think it's privilege to be told not to have feelings your entire life. because I'm sure as someone who's worked with men for 25 years, getting the feelings out is what makes things happen. I can certainly say yes. I mean, in economics, I've been privileged, but I think there's a way for us to have a conversation that can incorporate women and all of our brothers and sisters out there to say, let's take in what's ours. Let's have the courage to deal with what's ours. If I can help you by my story, then I will. I have a sense, I talk to people all the time now in this, and the same story over and over. Once you go through far enough on your path to get something to say, it becomes almost this driving force in your life to help people. And making money doesn't do it. I've interacted with some of the richest people in the world, billionaires who have gone on this path, and they're like, there's no number that does it for you. It doesn't matter how much you have. And I think a lot of people think this notion, you probably have heard it, emptiness. They think if I shovel more possessions and accomplishments and conquests into that emptiness, it will eventually fill. And in my experience, it never can fill. It's infinite. But I don't consider it emptiness. I consider it darkness. And we all have a light, and there's a way to uncover that light. And I think it's courage. And so if we can, I don't expect anybody to be further along than they are, because there was a lot of times when I wasn't exhibiting anything positive. But if we could orient around that and orient in that we're all in this as human beings together, and we all have this path, and our light's been covered up, and we can slowly uncover it. And if your light shines a little more brightly, then help someone else shine their life brightly. I mean, that's what you're doing. I can feel it. And so I feel blessed. And I certainly don't say I'm a dude. But I have done a significant amount of work, and I've made a choice that I'm gonna try not to have the things that happen to me impact negatively the people around me. And that was the only choice. And then what happened was I realized, when they start not to impact negatively, they actually start to impact positively, and that shifts my whole life.
I would say there's a lot of opportunity as well to speak to what leadership is.
I shifted as a leader dramatically because when I was deep in my trauma, people's things that were not a threat appeared to be a threat. And the way that I knew how to calm down a threat was I could take you down with words. I could make you feel less than. I could do a lot of different things. And what I started to see in leadership is as my neuro leadership, my nervous system calmed down, I started to learn what I think is important in life. My power started to be under rather than over. And so I backpacked in Africa after college. And I really like the way I've got a big lion tattoo on my arm, and it's got my two little kids as the protector. But the king of the jungle, the lion, one, they don't inherit their tribe. They get expelled from their group, and they have to go out and earn it. And when they do, what they do is through their provision, their power, they create a perimeter in which the women actually go and do the hunt and get the food, and the young lions learn how to be young lions. And then the king of the jungle lion is there to protect, there to serve in a way that allows them to thrive. And their growls go for 5 miles. It can be heard. And they're also not stagnant. They don't get a little piece of territory. They're constantly sort of seeing like, well, maybe this water supply would be better if we had access to it. And then my grouping would do better. So then they'll expand the territory. So they're not stagnant, but most of the time what you see them do is laying around yawning, looking at their people, making sure they're thriving. And at some point in business, I was in a lot of different kinds of businesses for a long time, but managing money. And the last one was with loans. And I got to the point where it was much more exciting for me, for the younger person, to go out and close a deal that I knew that I could close, but talking to that person easily. And yeah, I think those are the kinds of leaders that people want to be with and will really like stick with, especially the leader that doesn't say, oh, it's their problem. No, it's my responsibility. And then lifts them up. My experience is companies, business, all of that thrives a lot more when the leader is content enough in themselves not to try to hoard it all, right? Actually, there's a lot of abundance out here. I don't need to take it all. You can't have it all. It's sort of infinite. And if you operate from a more trusting instead of fear and scarcity, love and abundance, everybody gets more, everybody makes more, everybody's calmer. People, I remember having one of my employees at my other company as I was a little further down this path. And it was a really meaningful thing. He said to me, my wife loves that I work here. And I was like, why? And he's like, because I'm so much less stressed out because of the way you operate. Like, I'm so much better at home. And to me, honestly, that was a lot better than him closing $1 million loan or something. I felt like what I was doing, and he was doing really well in the business part of it. But like to hear that as a reflection, like somebody's family is saying that I liked what you're doing in your work because of the leadership that you're exhibiting, that's more hits you at the core of who you really are and who you want to be as a man more than money and possessions and status. And I have to take from you to get what's mine. I've known enough of those people for a long period of time, and I was one of them. It's not a path to happiness. It's a path to eventually being alone and feeling empty and not knowing why.
And what do you see for the rest of the year? What do you see for Neuro's journey? You said you got a book coming out.
Yeah, I'm writing a book. I'm about halfway through that, continuing. It's interesting. I mean, I'm trying to do a lot of things that I don't know anything about. 57 and doing a new career and all that, but I am writing a book which I'm really liking because it's helping me to clarify my thought about it. I think it will be very helpful for people who were like me, which is I didn't feel like I had the lay of the land of the playing field that I was dealing with. And so I would do this one thing and I would do it for a while and it might have had some benefit. And then I would be like, okay, I guess I stop. It doesn't really seem to be doing more. And so it will give people a little bit of insight into how we ended up a certain way. And more of an instead of saying you should do meditation or neurofeedback and all those things are great, it's more like, how do I operate in the world knowing this? Like, how do I like think about the overall plan and like a map of where I'm going? And because everybody's situation is different and there's so many treatments and almost all of them have some value. They might not for you or me, but you need to know that. So I'm working on that. That'll be out sometime in the fall, I would imagine. I am trying to continue to build my podcast. If you're interested in this thing, I think we have a lot of interesting guests on it. And then the other thing I'll tell you, what I'm trying to do is really engage my spiritual path. It's something that because of my past, I gave up on, and now it's become really important to me. And to me, that's inward stillness, meditation, continuing to sort of get the messages from whatever you want to call it, God, source. I rejected Jesus when I was a kid because of what happened to me and where it happened to me. But honestly, now I think he's a really great guy. So I'm trying to do all those things and along the way be a good dad and a good partner and offer help to people in any way that I can. So it's a pretty full life, as I'm sure you know, doing all these things. And it also feels great. And it feels like, oh, like I am, I feel like I can do this until the day I die. Not like I'm running out of energy. I couldn't have done finance until the day that I died. It was too much and there wasn't enough soul regeneration. But this feels like I could continue on this path and continue to grow. And I'm so blessed that you had me on the podcast. And I love your energy and what you're trying to do. And thank you so much for having me on.
I do want to recommend those listening, watching, connect with Steve. Like, I know you've talked about the nervous system. We didn't even touch on that really in depth. And man, go listen to his podcast talking about the nervous system and how you're treating trauma as an injury that can be repaired, and it's all the things that there's so much that we didn't even undo, and how quickly time flew by here. But um, enough of a taste to go see and find out more. And it's like, oh yeah, I want to digest some more of that content and information, and really find your way to healing. So Steve, I appreciate you and your work, and keep at it, and keep fighting a good fight, keep fighting for resilience.
Thanks so much, brother. I appreciate you having me on. And yeah, the Neuro's Journey, it's in all the places for podcast and Instagram for clips, and definitely reach out. What you were talking about, the nervous system as an injury, it's a really good frame, and you can heal it, and you can shift in things that you thought you could never stop, things that you thought were innate to you are adaptations that your brain made, and you can readapt it. I've been blessed in that way. So thanks a lot, EB. Thanks for the time. Thanks so much for your presence here. I really appreciate it.
All right, my friends. So it's Steve Sapourn, and go check out Neuro's Journey and keep fighting the fight for resilience. EB out here.